will stand up and clear my mother's name.
Stop making a fool of yourself, girl.
I'm my mom's lawyer. Maid's daughter stood up to Judge, then shocked him with her legal genius. I'll be my mother's lawyer. The words rang out in the silent courtroom like a hammer strike. For an instant, no one moved. The judge, Harrison Finch, blinked in disbelief. The opposing attorney, sleek and smug Mr. Peterson, let out a scoff that drew a ripple of laughter from the gallery. And Carol Ross, trembling in her chair, stared at her 11-year-old daughter as if she had lost her mind. The setting was cruelly lopsided. Carol, a maid barely scraping by, sat at the defendant's table alone, facing a lawsuit from Resolute Collections for a staggering $27,000 in medical debt. No lawyer would take her case. No ally stood beside her. The judge himself had already shown irritation, muttering about irresponsible debts and wasting the court's time. It should have been a slaughter. But then Abigail stood, a small figure clutching a thick book in her arms, her braid hanging down one shoulder. Her voice did not shake. Her eyes, wide but resolute, locked on the bench. "My mother doesn't need to be humiliated," she said. "She needs justice, and I can prove this company broke the law." A hush fell. Judge Finch leaned back, his mouth curving into a smirk meant to dismiss her. "And you, child, think you can lecture this court on the law?" "Yes, Your Honor," Abigail replied evenly, "because I've read it." Peterson chuckled and shook his head. "This is absurd. We can't let children play lawyer." But something in the girl's tone made even him falter. Abby laid her book on the table, a well-worn copy of statutes and regulations from the local library. Her hand rested firmly on the page marked Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. The audience shifted uneasily. The judge frowned. For the first time, the certainty in the room cracked. Could a maid's daughter, just a child, possibly dismantle a giant debt collection company? The question hung like thunder over the court. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish, its tall windows letting in beams of morning light that cut through the shadows. For most, it was just another building of authority. For Carol Ross, it felt like a fortress built to crush her. Carol had lived her entire adult life with humility and grit. She was not a woman of means, but of work. After her husband, Mark, died in a tragic car accident and year-long illness, she had been left with not only grief, but an avalanche of medical bills. She picked up every shift she could, cleaning houses during the day, waiting tables at night, and folding laundry for wealthier families on weekends. Her hands were raw, her back often in pain, but she endured it silently. Mark's absence haunted her. He had once been the optimist, the one who made their tiny apartment feel like a castle. But illness had eroded him. First his body, then his spirit. He hated watching Carol run herself into the ground. The night before he died, he whispered an apology she could never forget. "I should have protected you better." After his death, Carol faced not only sorrow, but harassment. Resolute Collections called daily, sometimes 10 times in a single evening. They threatened lawsuits, wage garnishments, even jail. They sneered over the phone, demanding payments for charges Carol knew were inflated or outright false. But she was powerless. When she tried to contest the debts, they drowned her in jargon and legal threats. And so she sat in court that morning, small and weary, clutching paper she could barely understand, staring down Peterson, a debt collector's attorney in a sharp gray suit who seemed to smirk with every breath. Abigail had watched all of this in silence. She was not like other children her age. While others filled their days with games or television, she spent evenings at the library, devouring books on finance, law, and history. What began as curiosity grew into purpose. She copied down passages about the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, underlining clauses about harassment, false threats, and illegal fees. She filled notebooks with questions, diagrams, and case examples. At home, she kept her discoveries secret. Carol worked too hard, and Abigail refused to add to her burdens. Instead, she prepared quietly, driven not by fantasy but by a steady fire, the need to protect the only family she had left. Their apartment was small but orderly. On the shelf sat a dusty chest once belonging to Abigail's great-grandfather, Sergeant William Ross, a decorated veteran known in the family as a man of iron principles. Inside, Abby found not medals, but books, manuals on discipline, ethics, and even law. Tucked between them was a photograph of the sergeant in uniform, standing tall, eyes sharp with conviction. Carol often said he believed bullies should never go unchallenged. Abby took those words to heart. The night before court, Carol sat at the kitchen table, face in her hands, whispering that she could not win. Abby did not answer. She stayed up until dawn with a lamp burning low, combing through call logs, letters, and every statute she had marked. She created a list of violations so precise it read like a prosecutor's indictment. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept through their blinds, she had a plan, and now here they were. The courtroom felt hostile. The bailiff's stern gaze, the polished shoes of lawyers tapping against tile, the quiet murmur of spectators. It all weighed down on Carol's chest. She felt like prey cornered by predators. Judge Harrison Finch entered, his robe sweeping the floor, his expression one of boredom and faint contempt. His reputation preceded him, efficient, unsympathetic, a man who had little patience for debtors pleading hardship. To him, the law was simple. You borrowed, you paid. Excuses were noise. At the plaintiff's table, Peterson adjusted his cufflinks and shuffled his papers with smug certainty. For him, this was routine. Another poor woman to be broken, another easy win. And then there was Abigail. She sat beside her mother, legs barely reaching the floor, her thick law book open in front of her. She did not fidget or shrink from the weight of the room. Her gaze was fixed on the bench, her mind already 3 steps ahead. The social hierarchy was clear. On one side, authority, wealth, and the law twisted to serve profit. On the other, a weary maid and her child. It was the very image of imbalance. But hidden beneath the surface was something no one yet saw, a force carried through generations, from Sergeant William Ross to his great-granddaughter, a legacy of resilience, discipline, and refusal to yield to bullies. It was this unseen inheritance that Abigail carried with her as she rose to speak. The game was about to change. The gavel struck. Case of Resolute Collections versus Carol Ross, Judge Finch intoned, his voice dry and perfunctory. Plaintiff, proceed. Attorney Peterson stood smoothly, his gray suit gleaming under the overhead lights. Your Honor, this is a simple matter. The defendant owes $27,000 in unpaid medical bills. She has failed to respond adequately to payment requests. We seek judgment in full, plus additional fees. His tone was polished, professional, but his smirk was unmistakable. To him, this was a performance, not justice. Carol swallowed hard, fumbling with her papers. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her hands shook so badly that the pages slipped from her grasp and scattered across the table. A muffled chuckle rippled through the spectators' seats. Judge Finch sighed, his impatience plain. "Mrs. Ross, do you have any defense?" Before Carol could answer, Abigail stood. The book she carried thumped against the desk as she placed it down with purpose. "Yes, Your Honor, we do." The courtroom buzzed. A child? Representing her mother? Finch raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching with disdain. "Young lady, this is not a school debate. Sit down." Abby lifted her chin. "With respect, sir, the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act says—" "Enough." Finch's gavel came down sharply. "Children do not practice law in my courtroom." The laughter grew louder this time, harsher. Peterson chuckled openly, leaning toward the bench. "If nothing else, Your Honor, this proves how frivolous the defense is. The poor woman has to rely on a child's imagination." Carol's face burned crimson. She reached for Abby's sleeve. "Please, sweetheart, don't—" But Abby pulled gently away. Her eyes did not waver. "I know what I'm saying, Mama." Judge Finch leaned forward, his glare heavy. "Young lady, if you speak again without leave, I'll have you removed." For a moment Carol thought it was over, the humiliation complete, her daughter silenced, her dignity stripped in front of strangers. But then Abby raised a single sheet of paper. Her voice, steady and clear, sliced through the laughter. "Resolute Collections called my mother 53 times outside legal hours. Here are the logs." The courtroom froze. Even Finch blinked. Peterson shifted uncomfortably but forced a scoff. "Irrelevant. The debt remains unpaid." Abby's small finger pointed to a highlighted passage in her book. Section 805A of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, communication at any unusual time or place, known or which should be known to be inconvenient to the consumer, is prohibited. Midnight calls, 6 a.m. calls, illegal. A hush fell. Finch's eyes narrowed, scanning the page she held out. The words were real. The statute was genuine. Peterson cleared his throat. "Even if true, the debt itself," Abby interrupted, her voice firmer now, "they also threatened her with jail. Twice. I recorded it." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small recorder, setting it gently on the table. Section 807, False or Misleading Representations. It's illegal to claim jail time for civil debt. The spectators, once smirking, now murmured among themselves. Some leaned forward, curious. Judge Finch frowned deeply, tapping his gavel against his palm. "Mr. Peterson, is this accurate?" Peterson stammered, "Your Honor, I would need to review—" But Finch cut him off. His earlier irritation was gone, replaced by something harder, heavier. "You came into my court seeking judgment. If these allegations are correct, then your client may be in violation of federal law." Carol sat stunned, tears prickling her eyes. She had braced herself for shame, for another crushing defeat. Instead, she watched her daughter, her quiet, bookish child, stand unflinching before the weight of the system. Still, the humiliation lingered. The judge had mocked Abby, the lawyer had sneered, and the audience had laughed. Carol had felt the sting of betrayal from every side, but now a shift had begun. What was dismissed as a child's fantasy was taking form as undeniable truth. And though Peterson scrambled, riffling through his papers, and though Finch's stern mask hid his growing respect, one thing had become clear to all. The maid's daughter was not here to play pretend. She was here to fight. The courtroom air pressed heavy on Carol's chest, but for Abigail, time seemed to slow. As the weight of dozens of eyes bore down on her, she thought not of the marble pillars or the judge's scowl. Her mind drifted back to nights when the world felt smaller, quieter, and yet just as heavy. It had started 3 years earlier, the day her father, Mark Ross, didn't come home. The accident shattered their lives in an instant. His body survived the crash, but not without injuries that demanded endless hospital visits, surgeries, and medications. For a year, the family lived in the fluorescent glow of hospital corridors. Mark growing weaker, Carol growing older with exhaustion, and Abigail shrinking into silence as she watched her parents fade under the weight of bills and fear. Mark had always been Carol's anchor. He was the one who believed in possibility, who painted hope across the bleakest days. Yet illness stripped him down, and debt gnawed at his pride. On his final night, as rain tapped against the window of his hospital room, he turned to Carol with cracked lips and whispered, "I should have protected you better." He passed before dawn, leaving Carol with grief and with creditors circling like vultures. The months that followed were merciless. Carol worked herself raw, 3 jobs, little sleep, always coming home with aching hands and a forced smile for her daughter. But the phone never stopped ringing. Resolute collections called morning, noon, and night. Their voices were cruel, sneering, sometimes outright threatening. They reminded Carol she was powerless. Abigail listened from the shadows. She saw her mother jump at every ring, cry quietly over letters filled with jargon she didn't understand. She never asked questions. Questions would only deepen her mother's sorrow. Instead, she searched for answers. One afternoon, while walking home from school, she passed the local library. Its red brick exterior seemed ordinary, but inside it felt like stepping into another world. She began spending hours there, poring over books most adults avoided: Consumer Rights and Protections, the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, legal basics for families. She copied notes into spiral notebooks, underlined passages, and whispered definitions aloud until they etched into memory. At first, it was curiosity. But as the threats against her mother grew louder, so did Abigail's determination. She began to see patterns in the harassment, the midnight calls, the false threats of jail, the inflated fees. Each one violated rules she now understood better than the collectors themselves. The librarians grew used to her visits. One elderly man even set aside books on finance and civil rights, sliding them across the counter with a quiet smile. "Knowledge is a shield, young lady," he said once. Abigail carried those words like armor. At home, she kept her work hidden, scribbling in notebooks late at night under the dim glow of a desk lamp. She practiced arguments in whispers, using her father's old voice recorder to sharpen her phrasing. She taught herself to stay calm, to breathe deeply before speaking. Her mother, though exhausted, sometimes caught glimpses. Once, entering the kitchen at dawn, Carol found her daughter asleep at the table, face resting on a pile of notes. She wanted to ask, wanted to tell her to just be a child, but the look of quiet determination on Abby's sleeping face silenced her. Then, one evening, while searching for blankets in the closet, Abigail stumbled upon the old wooden chest. It belonged to her great-grandfather, Sergeant William Ross, a man Carol rarely spoke of but always honored. Inside, beneath folded uniforms and a faded American flag, lay a collection of worn manuals, military codes, law handbooks, journals of discipline and strategy. At the very top sat a small leather-bound book filled with notes in the sergeant's own hand, reflections on justice, fairness, and the duty to protect the weak. Carol told her stories then, her voice trembling with both pride and grief. William Ross had been a stern man, but also fair. He believed the measure of a person was how they treated those with less power. He had died long before Abigail was born, but his presence lingered in the family like a compass. From that day forward, Abby kept the sergeant's notebook close. She read his words when fear threatened to overwhelm her. A bully is only strong until someone stands up. Then the giant shrinks to size. The night before the trial, Carol broke down completely. Sitting at their tiny kitchen table, she covered her face and whispered, "I can't do this, Abby. They'll take everything. We've already lost so much." Abby reached across the table and took her mother's hands. Her voice was calm, steady. "You won't lose. I'll stand with you." Carol thought it was just comfort, a child's attempt at bravery. She didn't know Abby had already prepared, organized the call logs, highlighted every violation, rehearsed the arguments. That night, while her mother cried herself to sleep, Abby stayed awake under the flickering lamp, building the case point by point until her notebook looked like the arsenal of a trained lawyer. Now, in court, as she faced Judge Finch and Attorney Peterson, she did not feel like an imposter. She felt like the heir of her father's love, her mother's sacrifice, and her great-grandfather's unyielding principles. She was not just a maid's daughter. She was William Ross's great-granddaughter. She was a soldier in her own right, armed not with weapons but with words, law, and truth. And today, she would not let her mother stand alone. The courtroom seemed to breathe differently after Abigail's first citations. The snickers had quieted. The judge, though still skeptical, leaned forward, no longer with boredom, but with something closer to caution. Abigail flipped through her notebook, her fingers steady. "Your Honor," she said, voice clear, "Resolute Collections has violated federal law on multiple counts. I can show you." Peterson scoffed, desperate to restore control. "This is a waste of time. She's a child reciting from a library book." But Abby didn't rise to his bait. She lifted a stapled set of phone records. 53 calls outside legal hours, she repeated firmly. "Here, logged with dates and times. Section 805A makes this unlawful." She handed the papers to the bailiff, who brought them to the bench. Finch adjusted his glasses and scanned them. His expression shifted ever so slightly. "And here," Abby continued, sliding another page forward, "2 voicemails where Resolute Collections threatened my mother with jail time. Section 807, false or misleading representation. That's a direct violation." A hush swept across the room. This was no childish play. It was evidence, tangible, precise, undeniable. Carol sat frozen, unable to comprehend the transformation of her daughter. The same girl who once hid in the library stacks now stood steady in front of men who had mocked her. Peterson's smile faltered. He shuffled his papers, muttering, "We'll need time to review." Abby didn't give him space. "And fees?" she pressed, her finger tracing another line in her notebook. "They demanded charges beyond the original debt. Section 808 prohibits unfair practices, including collection of unauthorized fees. We have letters." She slid them forward, every document neatly highlighted. The spectators leaned in, whispering. The shift was palpable. Judge Finch tapped his gavel lightly, not in reprimand, but in thought. His gaze settled on Peterson. "Mr. Peterson, these are serious allegations. How does your client answer?" For the first time, the attorney stammered. His polished confidence cracked. "Your Honor, I cannot verify these documents at this moment, but—" "Then don't speak as though this is simple," Finch snapped, his earlier contempt gone. He looked back at Abby, his sternness tinged with something almost like respect. "Young lady, continue." The room exhaled in astonishment. The judge had just given her the floor. Abby didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded, flipped another page, and spoke again with the poise of someone twice her age. "Your Honor, this isn't just about debt, it's about justice. Resolute Collections has broken the law again and again. If my great-grandfather were here, he would say what he always said: bullies lose when someone stands up to them. Today, I'm standing up." Silence hung thick. Even Peterson had nothing to say. Carol's tears spilled over as she gripped the edge of the table. Her daughter wasn't just speaking, she was fighting. And for the first time since entering the courthouse, Carol believed they might actually win. For a long moment, the courtroom was silent except for the rustle of papers and the faint hum of the ceiling fans. Then slowly, deliberately, Abigail lifted her head and looked straight at Judge Finch. "Your Honor," she said, her small voice filling the room with startling clarity, "this case should never have been brought here. Resolute Collections has broken the law in ways that harm not just my mother, but families like ours everywhere." Finch raised his eyebrows, studying her as though seeing her for the first time. He gestured with a flick of his hand. "Proceed." Peterson slammed his folder shut, his voice rising. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. She is a child." "Sit down, Mr. Peterson," Finch interrupted sharply. "Unless you intend to directly answer these claims, I will hear her out." The gallery gasped. The shift of authority was undeniable. A judge who had mocked her minutes earlier was now granting her the floor. Abby opened her notebook. Her hands didn't shake. Her words flowed with a rhythm she had rehearsed in whispers under her bedroom lamp. "First," she began, "the harassment. The Fair Debt Collection Practices Act says collectors cannot call before 8 a.m. or after 9 p.m. Yet my mother's phone records show calls at 6 a.m., 11 p.m., and even midnight. These weren't accidents. They happened 53 times." She lifted the highlighted logs. The bailiff carried them to the bench. Finch's jaw tightened as he read. "Second," Abby continued, "threats of jail. This is a civil debt. Jail isn't possible, but listen to this." She pressed play on the recorder. The courtroom filled with the oily voice of a collector. "Pay up, or the sheriff will come for you." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Carol buried her face in her hands, reliving the fear of those nights. "Section 807, Abby recited calmly, says false or misleading representation is illegal. Threatening jail is false. It's harassment." Finch's eyes hardened. "Mr. Peterson?" The attorney swallowed. "Those may have been rogue employees. My client cannot control." Abby cut him off, not rudely, but with precise authority. "Then your client is responsible for hiring rogue employees who break the law, and it happened more than once." The room stirred with murmurs of approval. "Third," Abby pressed on, "unlawful fees. The original hospital bill was $19,388, but Resolute Collections inflated it with bogus charges, processing fees, administrative penalties, and interest rates higher than the law allows. My mother kept every letter. Here." She handed them up. Each page bore neat highlights with numbers circled in red ink. Judge Finch leafed through them, his expression darkening with every page. Abby's voice softened, but her conviction sharpened. "My mother isn't irresponsible. She worked 3 jobs after my father died. She paid what she could, but she could never keep up with the lies. And when they scared her, when they told her she was a criminal, she believed them because she trusted that the law was real. But it was their law, not justice." The spectators shifted, eyes glistening. Even the stenographer paused a moment, her fingers frozen above the keys. Peterson tried again, his voice cracking. "This is emotional manipulation. None of this changes the fact that she owes money." Abigail lifted the sergeant's small leather notebook and held it against her chest. Her gaze never wavered. "My great-grandfather, Sergeant William Ross, taught my family that justice means standing up to bullies. He believed in truth and fairness, not intimidation. He fought in wars so people could live without fear. He wouldn't let a company like yours win by cheating." Judge Finch stiffened. His eyes flickered to the notebook, then back to the girl. For a moment, his stern mask broke, replaced by something raw, personal. He knew that name. He had once been a green lieutenant under Sergeant William Ross. The man had guided him, shaped him, taught him honor. Abigail didn't know this. She only spoke with the conviction of her bloodline. But her words struck Finch like lightning. "This court isn't just about numbers," she said finally. "It's about right and wrong. Resolute Collections broke the law, and they should not get to punish my mother for their crimes." The silence afterward was electric. Peterson's face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and sank slowly into his chair. Judge Finch sat back heavily, his gavel tapping once, twice, against the wood. His gaze lingered on the girl, then shifted to Carol, who sat trembling with both fear and pride. When he spoke, his voice carried a new weight. "The evidence presented suggests serious violations of federal law. I will not allow this case to proceed as though nothing has happened." He paused, eyes locking on Peterson. "Your client has not only overstepped, but may have committed fraud. This court will not be a weapon for bullies." The gallery erupted in murmurs, disbelief, and even applause before the bailiff called for order. Abigail exhaled slowly. Her small shoulders lowered, but her eyes stayed steady. The tide had turned completely. The child who had been laughed at was now the voice no one could ignore. The gavel struck hard against the bench. "This case is dismissed," Judge Finch declared, his voice firm, echoing across the chamber. "Dismissed with prejudice. Resolute Collections will not refile. Furthermore, I am ordering an investigation into their practices and restitution in the amount of $7,612 to be returned to Mrs. Ross. An additional $2,000 will be deposited into an educational fund for her daughter for what I can only describe as extraordinary courage." For a heartbeat, silence clung to the room. Then the gallery erupted. Applause thundered through the courtroom, drowning out Peterson's sputtered protests. Some spectators even rose to their feet, clapping, smiling, shaking their heads in astonishment at what they had just witnessed. Carol gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears spilled freely as she turned to her daughter and pulled her into her arms. "You did it, Abby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved us." Abigail leaned into the embrace but kept her eyes fixed on the bench. She had not fought for applause nor for reward. She had fought for her mother and for the principle that even the smallest voice could speak truth against power. Meanwhile, Peterson sat frozen, his face drained of color. His once smooth arrogance collapsed under the weight of humiliation. Papers trembled in his hands, his earlier smugness replaced by visible panic. The mighty machine of resolute collections had been cornered not by a team of lawyers, but by a child who had studied in silence. Judge Finch looked down at the girl again, his expression transformed. "Miss Ross," he said slowly, his tone carrying the weight of memory, "you remind me of someone I once knew, a man who taught me about honor." His eyes flickered briefly, almost imperceptibly, to the notebook clutched in her hands. "You carry that same spirit." Abigail nodded once, her face solemn. She did not need to know the details. It was enough that her words had reached him. The bailiff's call for order rang out, but it was unnecessary. The crowd's applause ebbed naturally, leaving a profound silence in its wake. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Carol Ross no longer felt small, and for the first time since her father's death, Abigail felt seen. The arrogant had fallen, justice had risen. When the last echoes of applause faded, the courthouse returned to its usual quiet hum of shuffling papers and distant footsteps. Yet, for Carol and Abigail, nothing was the same. They walked slowly down the steps, sunlight spilling over the marble. Carol kept her arm around her daughter's shoulders, as if grounding herself in the reality that they were free, free of debt, free of threats, free of the shadow that had haunted them since Mark's death. Reporters clustered nearby, shouting questions, cameras flashing. "How did you prepare? Did you really study the law yourself? What's next for you, Abigail?" Abby didn't answer. She wasn't chasing headlines. She only tightened her grip on the small leather notebook of her great-grandfather, holding it like a compass that had guided her through the storm. Judge Finch approached quietly, away from the crowd. His robe caught the breeze, his expression softer than it had been inside. He extended a small leather-bound book to Abby. It was a copy of the U.S. Constitution, well-worn, corners folded. "Keep this," he told her. "Sergeant Ross once gave me a copy just like it when I was a young officer. He told me the law is only strong when ordinary people believe in it. Today, you reminded me of that." Carol's eyes widened. You knew him?" Finch nodded. "He was my mentor. He taught me the meaning of justice. And now I see his fire in his great-granddaughter." He paused, then bent slightly so he was eye level with Abby. "Never let anyone tell you you're too small to make a difference." Abby clutched the Constitution tightly, nodding once. "I won't." The judge straightened, gave Carol a solemn look of respect, then disappeared back into the courthouse. That night, in their modest apartment, Carol tucked away the restitution check, and Abigail placed both the sergeant's notebook and the Constitution side by side on her desk. She opened her chessboard, the one her father had once used to teach her patience, and began to set up the pieces, not for practice, not for study, but for connection. Each move whispered across time, binding her to her father, her mother, her great-grandfather, and now to something larger, the enduring idea of justice. Carol watched from the doorway, a quiet smile on her face. For the first time in years, she felt not just relief, but hope. And as Abigail lifted a pawn and held it between her fingers, she whispered softly, almost to herself, Even the smallest piece can change the game.